All right, so we have a couple policies today that we wanted to go over. I think we have also just let the folks know that we have Christina Chamberlain on today just to help us out and give us some feedback on one of our policies. And I think we'll start today then with policy number 7320 that deals with alcohol, tobacco, drugs, and substance abuse for students. So when we last talked a little bit about the policy, there were some questions about children being able to bring in over-the-counter medications to school, and also herbs, if I remember correctly, into school. And we did do some checking on this. And just to be clear, the policy is really about, kids or folks who bring in and misuse drugs, alcohol, electronic cigarettes, basically. So it's really about the misuse of those in schools. So just wanted to share with the board, we did look into regulation. We did look in also state law just to see what is there. And in terms of the processes and procedures around even over-the-counter medications, children, we do have systems in place in our school district and really across the state where the regulation does allow for kids to bring in certain types of medications. They can bring in over-the-counter medications. And for those kids who need to self-medicate, there are some medications they can bring in as well. However, they have to have a doctor's note to say that they need to do so. And then it also has to say that they can self-administer those medications as well. So Christina, can you just give us just a little feedback about that process and what, and I think I sent out the regulations to everybody so that people will be able to see those regulations. Can you just share a little bit about that, Christina, for a minute?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So that is correct. Students can bring in their own medications, and they can get an order from their doctor that says that they can self-carry or self-administer. They're two separate orders because we do have students that can come into the nurse's office and self-administer. But if they want to carry, say, ibuprofen or Tylenol, we would need both. We would need a self-carry and a self-administer. The guidelines do focus. I think it was intended for emergency rescue medications like inhalers or EpiPens, but it does state in there that if students have other health conditions that would need immediate medication, they can also obtain those two orders. So we've been doing that for a very long time. I mean, since I've been with the district, mostly for older students. But we have had some younger students that have, taken. I actually had a kindergartner that had a self-administer, self-carry order, and it was for an enzyme for a student that had cystic fibrosis. So for that reason, she took it with her meals, and we were able to teach her how to become self-directed. But for the most part, it's older students. Tylenol, ibuprofen, inhalers, EpiPens, that type of thing.
Right.
Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Just one more thing, Christina. Oh,
yeah.
Heather, you want to go ahead first before you? Oh, okay. The only other thing I wanted to just mention to the board was also we had a question about herbs, and there are some herbs that there are quite a few that actually kids sometimes will try to bring into school. And we're not talking about seasoning salts, basically. We're talking about really, again, going back to the policy, those things that would be considered a misuse of alcohol, drugs, tobacco in school. And even with certain types of herbs, there still are regulations that say that schools don't have to allow those in. Christina, you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
If something is not FDA approved, the district does not have to honor that. It really does focus on things that are necessary, emergency. If it can be given outside of the school day, the recommendation on the regulation is that those type of medications or herbs should be given at home. There is a part in there that does say that the school does not have to allow anything that's not FDA approved. And we get those once in a while, and we usually refer that back to the medical director, who may have a conversation with the doctor who would have to order, would have to go through the same process, but I would refer that to our medical director at that point.
All right. Okay, so Heather, you had a question? Sorry about that.
Well, no, I guess I'm just wondering. So I also read the regulations as, you can basically give self-medication rights or whatever to kids who have those those issues that really required them to administer something quickly. But you're saying, Christina, that some students have brought in notes maybe like at the beginning of the year, and their doctor has said if they need ibuprofen or if they need Tylenol, they can self-medicate. And so those are on file in your office?
Yes. If they have a specific need, it would be like, for an example, migraine headache. If someone has migraine headache, they have to have a diagnosis, and then they have to be able to be determined that they're self-directed. And that would have a doctor's order, specific order for that patient, when they were to take it, where. Also needs a parent note to follow that.
Okay, so it can't just go ahead.
I was just going to say, we always try to have them only have a few on them, or what they would need for one day. We don't want them to carry a whole bottle of Excedrin or something with them. But we do keep the orders. I was just going to say, we do keep those orders in the nurses' offices.
But you're saying for very like I broke my arm, therefore I need Tylenol, that kind of a thing, as opposed to in the beginning of the year, this is a responsible student. The doctor agrees. They have the wherewithal to self-medicate. So they have my permission. That's not what you're talking about.
Yes, they can do that too. But the order should say why. They should say for pain, for headache, uncontrolled headache, menstrual cramps. There is usually a reason why. We ask for a reason.
Okay. I mean, obviously your last example there is something I'm very, sensitive to, obviously. And it's something that's kind of awkward for young women to have to, always address the adult for that issue, especially older girls, who have shown themselves to be responsible, taking care of themselves in that manner. So I guess I was curious about that. Secondly, the herbs that you referenced, Dr. Calvin, you're saying we're not talking about oregano and basil that people might want to come and bring in, put on their spaghetti. So I'm just wondering if there's a way we can state that then in the policy so that there's no confusion. Because the one thing I'm really concerned about is that it's the same discipline, whether you're caught taking a Tylenol before a sports, an athletic event because you have a headache versus, misusing alcohol before an athletic event. It's the same discipline, and I don't see those two acts as being equal at all in terms of breaking the rules. So one is illegal, especially if you're underage, the other is not. So I guess I kind of, when I first found issue in this, that's kind of what I was looking at, was that I'd like to kind of pare that out a little bit so that the discipline, how we follow through in terms of enforcement is made a little clearer.
So under the herbs part, we can put in parentheses, like we're not talking about general, seasonings, right? We're not talking about salt and pepper. We're really talking about, again, those things that would go under that category of misuse of alcohol, drug abuse. We're talking about illegal substances, herbs that could really impair someone or could really get people high or, have real trouble with. So we can certainly clarify in parentheses what we mean by herbs. We're not talking about, general seasonings like salt, pepper, basil, like you said. We're really talking about those illegal substances that could really harm children, basically. We
right, you're talking about like medicinal herbs.
Yes, we can put in parentheses that information for sure, right after the word herbs.
Okay, and so where I understand we're talking about misuse, it does just say though that consumption is prohibited. So,
yes.
Does other members of the policy committee, are you understanding the distinction I'm making?
Yes, I absolutely am, and yeah, it's a fine line, but I have to agree because I wouldn't have ever thought twice to give Gretchen 2 Tylenol when she went to school to in her little Ziploc snack bag to say, okay, if your ankle's bothering you, you need to take this. And I would have never thought to get a note from my doctor and send a note in, we're talking a junior or a senior. So, had I done that and she took 2 Advil in front of a teacher and the teacher then reported her, she would have received the same disciplinary action as if she brought in a bottle of beer. So that's not right.
Well,
that's where there kind of needs to be a little bit of difference, because Heather's right. One is okay, one is illegal.
So, the thing is again, when we talk about school settings, certain things can come into the school, certain things cannot, right? Medications, ibuprofen, Tylenol, all those things, it's fine when we have a very responsible student, but sometimes our students don't make the right choices. And sometimes they may give those medications to a friend who may have a headache or who may not be feeling well. And we have quite a few students who are allergic to like ibuprofen or Tylenol. And so it just takes that kind of a mix up to have the difficulty. So the best way in regulations that the state has afforded for that, so that way we don't have that difficulty, is to make sure if you're bringing any kind of drug, any type of substance, right, that could do any harm, right, is to make sure that you just get a doctor's note and there's a parent permission slip that's filled out, and then that process is resolved, right? You bring it in, okay, you can self-carry, you can self-medicate, right? And we do check in and monitor, make sure everybody's okay, and then we kind of go from there. But this is really, the policy again is about the misuse. Now, when we do see that children bring in substances, and some children, in variety of school districts across the state, they do those behaviors where they're giving this one a pill and that one a pill, and something goes wrong, then it is subject to the district's code of conduct, and also, the district's policy, basically. Yes, we do take a look at that. There's a process we go through to determine what was the cause, why did you do what you did, and then what were the outcomes of that as well. And then that procedure kind of goes from there. So, and one size doesn't fit all. I understand what you're saying, but there is the policy, there is the procedures in place. Really, it's geared to kind of protect kids from any harm that could take place from just a simple Tylenol that sometimes kids may not think would be a problem for somebody else.
So again, I understand that, but distribution is different than consumption for personal use. That's very, very different. If you're distributing any kind of medicine or medicinal herbs or anything to another person, obviously that's something we would want to take very seriously. But consuming a Tylenol yourself because you have cramps, that's something that I don't think you should be suspended for. Now, I do appreciate the fact that I never knew, 2 girls have now graduated, and I never knew that you could go to your doctor and say, write them a note that they are responsible and they can self-medicate and whatever, and I can file it at the nurse's office and therefore they're covered. I never knew that. So, maybe that's something that we can, I'm not exactly sure. Certainly don't want to advertise that, Go ahead. I'm burbling.
Even the consumption, though, can be of concern, because sometimes there are children who may have a reaction one time to something and then a totally different reaction another time. And we can't decipher what happened, when they take it, who, what, where, and how. And so, again, the way to make sure that is all surveillanced or checked on, or that we have oversight to make sure what is from what isn't, it's through the doctor process, right? We're not saying we don't want kids to be able to self-medicate. We understand they're older, right? They grow, and we want them to be independent. We're just saying if you do it in schools, we're following the regulation from the state ed department, which says you just have to have a doctor's notice and a parent signature, and then you're all set. Pam, sorry. Pam, did you have a question? I
think that maybe. Right. It's not like you want to go advertise, send a note in, but I'm not sure parents read the policies.
Right.
So how do we get them to pay more attention to, like this policy in particular without
so it's not
opening a huge can of worms up? Because
at the beginning of the year, the principals meet with their students. Right. Okay. There's documentation that's done. Some of them, they used to have agendas, but they sit and they meet and they explain to the students the rights and responsibilities that they have in their schools. And this is one of those pieces that is talked about. We have very few issues with this. Our community is used to doing it. This is what we've done from what I can find up since past 2015, Christina. So, it does.
Before that even, yeah.
So
yeah, but
people.
You just heard Pam say that she would send in Tylenol and not think twice about it with her daughter.
I think it used to be in a student handbook. Do we still have a student handbook? I'm pretty sure it's in there.
Correct. Yes. And every year there's a code of conduct book that also goes out to the parents. I don't have it here in front, but that does have that information in there. Now, if we need to share more information with the parents, we certainly will. Sometimes people may not know certain things, but it is the procedure that is widely used, and it's what the state requires us to do.
Lisa, did you have feelings about this? 'Cause I still feel very strongly about separating out illicit use from. My mom sent me in with a Tylenol. I didn't read the code. I didn't read the student handbook. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can understand both like the need for a policy like this, but also the need for, as students get older, that so like, maybe it's because like my kids are younger, but like I've read the policy, like I read the student handbook, and I wouldn't, and even when I send in kids like send in medicine to the elementary school, like I can't even send it in with him. I have to bring it in with him. I think getting a doctor's note, I mean, I think actually the recommendation, were I a principal, what I would recommend to students would be to say, when your kid goes in for their annual visit, make sure that you get this letter, that for whatever, like, insert generic thing, they can take ibuprofen or Tylenol, which is probably going to end up overdoing it. But Heather, your point that you made when we talked about this in the last policy committee meeting was that not everyone, like, many people have to pay a really high copay when they go to the doctor. And I think even to get a note, like, often the doctor will want to see the child, like they're not just going to give the note. So I think it sounds like it's not a heavy lift for families, but it could be a heavy lift for families. And yeah, I was looking at the language, and yeah, I mean, maybe if we could separate out, like, like we walk this fine line between wanting to have responsible students and families and then having to write policies for the worst case scenario, which doesn't allow them to become independent and demonstrate their responsibility, like, for good reasons. If someone's allergic to ibuprofen, we don't want them taking it or someone giving it to them. But then the kids who are bringing it in need to know that this isn't something you can give out. So, I mean, I guess I would feel more comfortable with like a difference between like the licit use and the illicit use of having these.
Right. Lisa, if I can just add. So again, I just think we're missing. So in the policy, the first paragraph, this is not talking about someone who has, been given approval to do this. This is really about the misuse of this. Like the first paragraph deals with the misusage of these particular items. So I think it separates it out basically because of that language that's there. I guess a couple of things that I'm thinking. I don't think we really have the right to say someone can, and I'm not sure anyone's saying this, but we don't have the right to say that kids can come to school and self-medicate in school without a doctor's note. That's in regulation in law. We can't do that. Now, parents can give them, a Tylenol before they go go to school, at the beginning of the day. When they come home, they can give them another Tylenol. I don't know how long they last or not for kids, but I don't think that we don't have really the right to override the regulation in the law and say, they can self-medicate. That's the regulation in the law.
Right, but we do have the leverage to change the discipline, like how we go about dealing with perpetrations of the code. I'm sorry, Pam, I stepped in front of you.
Right.
Nope, that's okay. It does say in the very first paragraph, it's the inappropriate consumption, sharing, selling, use, and or possession without permission. So for the very most part, it really is talking about the inappropriate use. But yeah, I still so wish we could do something in the disciplinary area of, So yeah, like, let's just say a student, the parent made the mistake, gave the 2 Advil and said, in 4 hours, take this if the pain comes back. I'd hate to see that you know, that's an honest mistake. They're not handing it out. So that would be, you know, maybe just a meeting reminding that you need to have the note in to do it this way, where, you know, that instance wouldn't be a full-fledged disciplinary action.
So
I think that that's the difference.
Yes.
I hear you, Pam. I understand exactly what you're saying. And I'm thinking also, just off the top of my head, so here we're talking about policy, but in terms of how the discipline has happened or how it takes place, so we have a different process, the code of conduct. When we do those meetings every year, I think maybe that's something that we should bring up in that forum. That's really where we start to look at how the discipline would be. That's a document that we use to figure out how we discipline. Does that make sense? Right. I see, Heidi, your hand was up.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that I agree with what you're saying, Heather, about the disciplinary outcome. And I just wanted to let you know that we do take that into consideration. So I know we're talking about a general policy that will guide us in the future, but this does happen pretty rarely that we're only talking about a couple Advil, a couple Tylenol. We do tend to be talking more about the illegal substances. So on the time or two in the last probably 3 or 4 years that I can think of, that a very responsible child, responsible family weren't aware of the policy and sent in a couple Advil for just the discussions that you've been talking about. Bob Duffy and I have had conversations with the particular administrator and the superintendent to say, here's this very unique circumstance. Is it all right with you if we document that we met with the family, document that we wrote out what an understanding of the policy is so the family knows the process in the future, brought the nurse in to give the right form. We don't necessarily go through with, you know, a long-term suspension and a superintendent's hearing. So but I agree with Dr. Calvin. This is a great place to have some maybe differentiation in the code of conduct. And Dr. Duffy is just starting up the annual code of conduct meetings. So maybe that's a great place to address it.
Yeah, because it says in accordance, thank you, Heidi. That's nice to know the history of those cases. I know it happens a lot more than probably is caught. I just know that anecdotally from, you know, other parents and friends and things like that. So it says in accordance with district policy, district code of conduct, and similar documents regarding these things. So it just leaves me feeling like uneasy. You know what I mean? That it isn't kind of spelled out what happens, but
I think we purposefully have left the policy under discipline a bit vague because that's where we have some leeway outside of ed law, state policy. It gives us a little wiggle room to make some consideration for individual circumstances. And I agree with you. I know that lots of kids are carrying some Tylenol, some Advil, and we don't go around searching bags as a norm. So we wouldn't know that probably more than just a handful are self-carrying, and they shouldn't be.
So what if we just take what you've done and add inappropriate to the consumption under disciplinaries as well? Like if we just add for the inappropriate consumption again, so that we're just very clear that we aren't talking, you know, we really are talking about the misuse.
Okay.
Without permission.
Sure. Can do that. Sure.
And then I do think it's something I would like to see addressed in the code of conduct, so that we aren't demonizing the poor girl who's got cramps versus the one who's like bringing in, you know,
right,
their Juul and their alcohol and everything else. It's two very different things.
I think we're all in agreement with you, Heather, on that for sure. I have the code of conduct here in front of me now, and so I'm going to put a note in it. So this year that will be something that we'll definitely look at. There is an area around drugs in that, you know, inappropriate drug usage there. So we can put something in the code when we come to that this year. We can certainly come back and revisit that. Absolutely.
Okay, sounds good. And so, Lisa, I totally agree with everything you said too. It sounds like we need to get into the state legislature to get that changed.
All right. Okay, are we good then?
Christina, thank you so much for bringing your expertise and your time. We really appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks, Christina, for all you do.
Anytime. I was just going to add that I was just invited to the Code of Conduct meeting next week too. So
Excellent. Carry the message. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Would you like to go on now to the naming of school facilities policy here for just a little bit? Okay. So
Okay.
I
Doing
did.
the hard ones.
Yeah. So I shared. They're all busy this time, I would say.
Yeah.
I did share with the board, a copy of our current policy, and then I shared with you a copy of the Fulton's policy, Mexico's policy, and we got a policy here from Heather on the Dexter School District policy. There are some districts who try to basically keep their naming of school facilities very small, very broad, so that the board can kind of do whatever it needs to at a specific time. And then some are much more, in depth, because it's always a busy kind of issue that people want to discuss and talk about. So questions or concerns or your thoughts about the policies, I guess, open the floor.
I actually think this is a new day and age when it comes to naming anything after anybody. And I just read a pretty good article about the that whole practice, in the macro scale when it comes to not just school districts, because when you name anything after a person, you name them after like all of their humanity. So, we're seeing it with, things having to be renamed as we revisit historical figures and that kind of a thing. So that's one piece. And then you also have that piece where you name a facility after a human being that then, 20 years later, their legacy is not kept alive. Whatever amazing thing they did to get their name on the building is not, their story is not retold in the halls of that building. And so I will tell you today, I have no idea who half the people are, gentlemen that our elementary schools are named after. And I think that's, if they were that important, I think that's sad. So, but then again, maybe this generation needs a different name for their school. So I just think it gets really, really tricky. And I think naming anything after a human being, it should be rare. And I think it should be something, it's somebody who did something absolutely spectacular, not just their longevity, not just, they were here forever and therefore, I think the Fowl Theater is a good example of someone who did something, exceptional. I don't know anything else about that person except for what Lisa told me. And I think that's a pretty cool story that should be told. But I can guarantee you no one in our high school knows that story. So that's kind of a mesh of what I think about naming facilities after people.
Anybody else like to share it all before I'll make some recommendations to you. Pam, go ahead.
I don't disagree entirely with Heather at this point in this day and age to go forward, choosing a person to be named after. I agree. Most people don't know stories behind any of the names of any of not even just school district buildings, other buildings. I don't want to change names we already have though, because I think they do have significance and we just need to educate people on the significance of those names. But I, going forward, would not choose to name a facility or a field after an individual, just because times change far too quickly anymore.
Yeah, I guess I would just add quickly, I think it makes sense for our policy to have a framework set out for how things would get renamed or who should be involved in, just to lay out the possibility that, that it may happen, right? We're not going to be building any new buildings, right? So the next really great person isn't going to be able to have anything named after them. So I think it would make sense to have that framework laid out. And, I don't know about, I actually, Heather, till you just said that, I know Kingsford Starch, I know Fitzhugh owned a factory. I don't actually know very much about the other two, right? But, I think we probably, should be celebrating that history more if there's something to celebrate. And if not, then, maybe we can think about what we want to name, the value of what these names are.
Yeah. So I guess I'm in agreement with everything that all of you said. The only thing I'm thinking is, generally speaking, what many districts do, not all, they try to keep the policy as broad as they can, because once I'm not saying you have to do this, but once you hone in on a process, just so you're aware, you're committed to that process throughout, and it really is dependent. Like some districts will say, we want local figures or international figures. Or they have to be a certain age, or they have to do a certain thing. Then there may be a school named after a child, or it could be named after someone who may not even be associated with the district. So and different times, different things happen. Does that make sense, right? So I don't know. You can be as broad as you want, or you can be as narrow and focused as you want as well. But my suggestion would be, so when I normally think about policy, I try to make it as broad as we can so it can encompass a couple different processes and procedures. And so the board doesn't get itself locked into, it has to be this way, because different times calls for different measures, and even with naming of buildings. Just my thoughts and suggestions off the top of my head. Pam?
Yeah, I have to agree. I think a broader policy obviously isn't going to lock this board into anything, but future boards also then don't have to come back and try to redo the whole policy if it's broad enough that, yeah, I think it just makes it easier for the future boards also.
Lisa?
Yeah, I guess I agree with what Mathis just said. And what I meant by process is that, maybe it's that we have a committee for naming, right? And the committee for naming shouldn't only be the Board of Education, or shouldn't only be, whatever entity that it's kind of like our strategic plan, right? We'll draw from stakeholders, including whatever, alumni, current people. So that's what I mean by setting out a process that that there's a way we're going to go about doing this that makes sense and is clear, moving forward.
Right. So can I just ask, when you look at the policy right now, 3160, let's say the board may exercise its discretion in selecting the names of a school and a facility. So that keeps the board having the right of, you can have whatever name you want, basically. And then in terms of general discussion, it says, in choosing a name for the new school or the facility, the board should be guided by considerations of good taste. That's one I would just circle. Concern for public relations and sense of historical appropriateness. So you give up no rights there. Consideration may be given to historical figures of local or national importance, district geography, former school officials or staff, or the involvement of a particular individual in planning or construction of the facility. So
yeah, that's the part I would take out. I would take all that out and maybe say, note that naming a facility after a person should be rare, or maybe say it not at all, because I think one of our problems is that the name that's picked becomes a community battle, and you get pros and cons from 50% of the population one way, 50% of the other, and it's very hard. And then the board becomes, right in the middle of a community, disagreement on the name. And so, it really becomes very difficult.
Yeah, okay.
And messy.
Okay.
It's very messy, yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to outline, I'm going to highlight that area. Then look at the next paragraph says, the board may solicit input from staff, students, parents, and the community. It says you may, doesn't mean you must, right? With connection with the decision, like Lisa was talking about a committee, right? So, and then the board may permit placing of appropriate plaque or memorial at a facility. Instead of doing a naming, you could do you can always have a plaque there instead. So that kind of keeps you open, basically. So I think with the exception of that piece that Heather just kind of outlined, most of this is actually kind of open and broad enough that it doesn't lock you into a specific process or procedure or naming you know, that one part about consideration may be given to historical figures. I mean, maybe you just put in there the board can consider a variety of, you know, figures.
I don't think you have to say, I think you just take it out, right? Because I personally would like to see that people we honor be put on a plaque and you know, put around. And in fact, that's how this conversation first got started like 6 years ago, was when someone died and they wanted to name a library after her. And we said, no, let's have like a Hall of Fame or, you know, do something with plaques that, you know, memorializes the person. It's very important to do that, but doesn't commit a whole building to the memory of someone that in 30 years isn't going to be as poignant as it is now.
And you know what, Heather, that's pretty consistent in terms of with our practice right now. So like even just outside of my office, there's a big board up with the name of the superintendents, the former superintendents or current. There's plaques all around the district in many of the buildings. You know, it could be a teacher that was there, passed away, or someone was former principal or something like that. That does help with some of the naming of the buildings. So that's a practice that's consistent with what we're already doing.
I think the problem is right now we're in the process of building new things and overhauling things, and so people are going to come out of the woodwork with, you know, their person. And I think we need to be, the whole reason I think we need to visit this and be clear, like Lisa said, is so that we don't get embroiled in a community disagreement.
I agree, totally agree. So if the board is okay, we could just take that sentence out, and that still, everything else is broad enough that would do what I think I'm hearing that everybody would be okay with. Pam, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay, yeah. Back to the plaques and buildings, it certainly allows us to honor more people that way, because let's face it, there's only a handful of buildings and 2 handfuls of fields around in our district. So there you're limited to people that you could recognize, where a plaque in buildings is endless. Walls are everywhere.
And this also says, in choosing a name for a new school and other facility, I'm not sure it speaks to the renaming if that was something that future boards wanted to visit. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I'd like to actually take, when considering former school officials or staff or the involvement of particular, and whatever that is, you add that piece to right here, the board is permitted to erect or place an appropriate plaque or memorial. That way we're kind of like moving people to that spot. And we're not saying you can't name a facility after a person, but we're really kind of saying this is what we prefer to do with people. Does that make sense? And they don't all fit, but basically the ones that refer to people.
Yes, that can go right down to that. We can add that, move it around to the final paragraph. That makes sense. Good.
Then I think the only thing we need to decide, Lisa and Pam, do we want to say anything about renaming or let it we could take out new, choosing name for a school as opposed to new school, and that way it's any school.
Yeah, I like leaving it more vague there. I also wonder if we would want to say, instead of saying
Lisa, we're having a hard time hearing your voice.
Sorry, I need to get I had my finger over the microphone. I forgot to configure my computer still. Oh, you know what I could do is I could jump on my kid's Chromebook. That would make life easier. So what I was saying was, I like the rename a school instead of a new school, right? This way we kind of just make it again like a little bit broader and a little bit vaguer. I also wonder, what would people think about where it says the board may solicit input from the staff, students, blah, blah, blah. If we say the board should, right? So it's not saying shall, that we're like requiring them to do it, but I mean, I think it makes sense. I don't think it should just be a board decision, you know?
So when you say should, it changes it from may.
Right, it changed. Well, it's saying we're recommending to them, like it doesn't say that. So between the difference between like may, should, and shall, like shall means they have to do it. May means we could do it. Should means we recommend you do it.
Well, you could say it is recommended that the board solicit,
Right. Okay. Yeah. The board recommends soliciting input.
or yeah,
Or
the policy recommends it. It is
Yeah.
recommended either way. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I wrote that there. Nancy, did you want to say something? I saw your hand was up there.
Yes, so in one of the policies that you, sample policies from another school district that you sent out, Dr. Calvin, the Dexter one, the
Mhm.
very last line of that says the board will make the final decision and reserves the right to reject any proposal to name or to rename a building or facility. And I saw that not only in this one, but in one of the other ones that you forwarded to us. So I think that that might be something that the board may choose to have.
Yeah. Good idea,
Definitely.
Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
Okay, great. Okay, all right, so I think I got it all.
That was easy.
We will pull it all together and we'll get it into the first reading. Okay? All right, perfect. Are we good to go on to the next policy? Everybody okay? Good, okay. All right. So why don't we talk about district cell phone use policy 5322. See if I can bring the other one up. And basically this policy is, what we want to do is revise the policy and update it around cell phone usage. We are now moving to a place where basically the district will provide cell phones for all of our administrators and folks that need them. And so we wanted to try to just add some revisions here. Nancy, I know we had some new things in red that we sent out here, I believe earlier today. You want to kind of read through that piece that you have allowed, and then we can go from there with the board?
Sure. So the old policy really had to do with those plans where you could identify who was who was using the phone at the time. And now with new cellular plans, they just group everybody together. So this policy really reflects that change, and we cannot require employees to carry district cell phones. It's a subject of negotiations. So in here, it says a district-owned cell phone may be issued to a district employee upon request when necessary to that employee's job duties as determined by the superintendent or designee. And then it says the employer shall make every attempt to use their cellular phones for business purposes only. In the event an employee uses a cell phone for other than business purposes, he or she shall reimburse the district for non-business calls. Individuals authorized to use district cell phone shall agree in writing to accept financial responsibility for any inappropriate usage by that individual, and the district provided cell phone may not be used by anyone other than the school district employee.
Okay. All right. Thoughts from board members?
I'm forgetting what the problem was early on when we first talked about cell phone use. And Nancy, you did a lot of research to get a cell phone policy in place. What was the sticking point at the time?
So a couple things. One is that we were being reimbursed for the use of our cell phones, and the board wasn't getting any updates on, well, if you're being reimbursed, how much is personal use and how much is business use? And how do you quantify that? Excuse me. So I think that was one of the issues.
Okay.
And the other issue is just to make sure that employees are using that. If they do have a district cell phone, how are we going to manage that? Most of the district cell phone plans now are on state contract. So in terms of getting a plan, it's quite easy now. And then maintaining it in terms of figuring out who's using it for their personal use, it's a little tricky. And before, where they used to identify all of the numbers that phone was calling way back in the day, well, that was easy because if you had a 607 number, you knew that was out of state. But now you could have a 607 number and live in Liverpool. So it becomes a little trickier as to how to identify that. I don't know if you want to leave that in or take it out.
I mean, you can leave it in and let it go ahead, Lisa. Sorry.
Hey, Lisa?
Did Lisa say something? Oh no,
I
she
think
left.
she left the meeting. She probably there she is.
Oh no,
Come back
she's Benjamin. Hi Ben. So I'm just wondering about the first issue with the, I guess a contract now speaks to this issue, and how does the contract read?
So you mean in terms of the bargaining unit contracts?
Yeah, because this is policy, but our contract also speaks to it.
Right. So pretty much we're all of the bargaining units that would have been affected. We have only one individual left. We have negotiated that reimbursement. We have negotiated the reimbursement out of the contracts, so they would not be able to get reimbursement now. So now, if you need to have a cell phone, right, the district will give one to you, and then you have to use it responsibly. You can't give it to anybody else, and you have to use it for business purposes. And then if there's any problem, then you're responsible to pay for that. I see Benjamin Braun. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lisa.
I'm sorry. So I think one of the challenges previously was that when cell phones first came out, you paid for every call, outgoing and ingoing. And it's just not the case anymore. I think it's fine for us if we want to lay out the guidelines to say you should only be using this for business. But once you pay for it, you're paying for it regardless if you use 5 minutes or 5,000 minutes, right? So I guess I'm no longer, since we figured out the whole reimbursement part of it, I'm much less concerned about the content of this policy, to go back to Heather's original question about why are we reviewing this one?
I agree.
So since we really don't have a way to monitor anymore what was district use and not, can we remove the part about reimbursing? Because it's moot in a way, or are you not wanting to do that because that can kind of keep people honest?
Yeah, I think I would just leave it, just because in case it's out there, right? If we find out you're using the phone for the wrong reason, because it's taxpayers who are paying for it. So if you're misappropriating or using it the wrong way, you need to pay us back. I think I would leave it personally. Okay. So we have the way that Nancy is. We've got the revision there. Is that okay with the group? Are we okay with that one? With the red? Okay. We're good. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now I want to talk about the communicable disease policy 5691, I believe it was. I think this is one that, if I remember correctly, there was a question about, having a conversation about this. I think the big thing was about the regulation procedures would be developed for dealing with communicable diseases in ways that protect the health of both students and staff while minimizing the disruption of in-person education process. So from what I understood, one piece is about how do we handle these situations that involve communicable diseases, and then two, I think the second piece was about prioritizing in the policy in-person learning, continuation of food service, availability of tools, and so on, basically, if I remember correctly. So I think one of the things, just to mention, to be clear, so now there is a process in place where we actually have to kind of prepare every year for a communicable disease. So if you recall, earlier this year, we had a pandemic plan that we had to put together, and the board had to approve that plan. And in the plan, it actually talks about a number of the things, like how we handle things, what are our procedures, what are our priorities. And this plan is to be updated every year. And it can be changed depending upon what is happening at the time. So, I know there was a question about, should we prioritize, in this policy, in-person learning or food service, availability of tools to continue education virtually, education activities and athletics. Lisa, you wanted to share? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is based on what I had sent to you. Yeah. So I think in that case, and actually I forgot about the annual pandemic plan, but it's pretty clear, I think 2011 was either SARS or MERS or bird flu. It was pretty clear that this was put together in reaction to another global pandemic. And if now we have an annual pandemic plan, maybe then this policy can just say like the district should review and update its pandemic plan annually and just like refer it to that.
Yeah.
Just because what is not what we did. So that's all.
I'm in agreement. Total agreement.
I agree too. Just have it referred.
Refer
And
to
it's
the-
something that's reviewed annually, so why not?
Okay. Yes. Okay. I'm good with that. Everybody good with that?
I just want to know, how did you come across that, Lisa?
I'll give you one guess. Jim McKenzie. He was like, hey, did you know we actually have a flu plan? Like, it literally says pandemic flu. And I was like, and I looked it up and I was like, well, look at that. We do.
You have the right keyword, but I was impressed. You gave credit to Jim, but I was very impressed with you. I'm like, what?
Yeah, no, it's funny because like I'm the political scientist, but he's way more the like I think he's read the whole policy book.
Well, that's great. That's what you need. You need someone who can do that.
There you go. Okay, right. So we just end off tonight with last policy 3150 that deals with school volunteers. Now, I sent out a red updated document because this policy, so basically it's dealing with volunteers, but we do have, several different types of volunteers, right? So we have your regular school volunteers, parents who come and they help out with special events happening in the classroom, or they go on a field trip with the kids, right? Or they do something with it could be a play or something like that. But we also have another group of folks that we want to just be concerned with, and that is, our athletic department volunteers. So I changed the subject from just school to school/district volunteers. And when I say athletic volunteers, we're not talking about volunteer coaches, because they fall under a different category. What we're dealing with is those folks who come in and say, hey, I'm available to help out with anything that's going on with athletics. What can I help with, right? What are some things that I can help with? And so what we did was we kind of went through and I checked to see what are the procedures that we have and what are the practices. And so here's what I put in. So I put in here athletic department volunteers. This does not include volunteer coaches. The following are procedures and expectations that are specific to district athletic volunteers. Again, not volunteer coaches, okay? So any person who is interested in becoming an athletic volunteer, they have to complete an athletic volunteer application, and then they forward that on to the athletic director, okay? Once the athletic director receives the application, they review it, and then they determine if there is a volunteer needed in that area or whatever, what's needed. And they outline in writing the specific duties that the volunteer would assist with. When the athletic director has determined that the volunteer is needed, the specific duties for the volunteer will be shared. This information will be shared with the superintendent and or his designee for a final approval and review. And it should be noted that the superintendent does have the right to approve or disapprove, of any of our athletic volunteers. And then once final approval is received from the superintendent and or his designee, the athletic director will contact the volunteer to inform them of their duties and the information that's, attached to it. And then the athletic director will provide supervision for that volunteer throughout the duration of their assignment. A district file of all approved volunteers would be maintained in the district office. I think the only thing that we wanted to try to make clear was, okay, so there is a process, right? So they have to put in their information, right? And they do go through the Raptor system like all of our volunteers, all parents go through that, okay? And then, what happens is once we get the information, then the athletic director kind of says to us, okay, where do we need this person? Where, who, what, where, and how? Sometimes we do have people who want to do a variety of other things. We have to be careful with that because some of the things that people may be asking to do are contract bargaining unit, items. And we would violate some of the contracts by doing, like some people would say, hey, I want to maybe do the clock, the time clock. And I believe that is under one of the contracts. Am I correct, Heidi, if I remember correctly, right? Some may say, well, I would like to help with the supervision, right? I'm going to do oversight of the crowd. We do have chaperones for the crowds, and we have to be careful that we are not distributing other contractual work. So the volunteer that would work with the athletic director, who will say, okay, here's something you can do. It might be traveling with a team of kiddos to an event. It might be helping, I'm just trying to throw things out there right now. I'm trying not to say the wrong thing, because someone will call me and say, that's a contractual thing. So I don't want to say the wrong thing, but it could be a variety of things. Does that make sense? And whatever it is, that athletic director will work with them, make sure that person has all the tools, get them in place so that they can be utilized to the best of our ability, basically. So that's what I have. Looking for your feedback from the board.
So I guess I'm not sure why we're distinguishing between athletic volunteers and like maybe a volunteer for like a club. And I think one distinction I see as I read New York State ed law is the difference between, someone who is, teachers in the room, coaches in the room, whatever. There's that employee is in the room and you're just assisting with the children versus I'm alone with kids, or alternatively, I'm going to be with kids for an extended period of time, like day in and day out over an extended period of time. So those are distinctions, I think, in terms of volunteer roles that are more qualitative. And so I'm just kind of wondering, so we have school volunteers and athletic volunteers, but if I'm going to volunteer for Envirothon Environmental Club to help out there, am I going to be a school volunteer, or is that more athletic because it's the same level of engagement with kids?
It all happens in schools. But, the clubs or the classroom ones, those are what we would consider to be school volunteers. The athletic piece is a little bit different. Now, we could, if you want to, we don't have to say athletic volunteers. We could just say athletics if you want, and just leave it as a subcategory, basically. We could do that if that.
Well, I guess I'm not understanding what differentiates someone who's working with a team versus working with a club, especially if it's just a volunteer. It's not, I understand the coaching piece. I get volunteer coaches. It's a lot more rigorous and you have to have some credentials behind you to do that. But I'm thinking if you're just volunteering with a team, how is that different than volunteering with a club or like going to Europe with the, with the Spanish club?
I mean, I think the only real big difference would just be, hey, you're focused more on athletics versus some of those other areas, in terms of more of those instructional areas, basically.
But I guess as we look at policy, the difference I see is it's going through the athletic, like we're adding the athletic director as another piece to the pie versus, I'm not exactly sure with the other pieces.
The other ones that go to the principals.
Right, to the principal.
Yeah, the other one goes to the principal. This one goes through the athletic director. Pam, I see your hand was up there.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify that I think the difference is that if it's an athletic volunteer, the athletic director is the supervisor of them. When they're a school volunteer, if they're in a classroom, the classroom teacher's their supervisor, but wholly it's the building principal of whatever building they're in,
right,
or whatever club, is whichever building that club is affiliated with. If it's the middle school or the high school or one of the elementaries, that falls then to their principal to oversee the school volunteers or the club volunteers.
Right. Heidi, you supervise the athletic area, as well as you do the secondary schools. Any other thoughts that you might have? I agree with Pam.
I was just saying, I hear what you're saying, Heather, about why is there a differentiation, but I think Pam just summed it up quite nicely, because if you volunteer for a club, like Heather, I think you volunteered with the Ag Club before, that's typically in conjunction with the club advisor and under the supervision of the appropriate principal. There's clubs at all levels, elementary, middle, high, but athletics is more differentiating the fact that volunteer application would go to the athletic director, and the athletic director would then work with the coach to figure out what's the person going to do with you and how often.
So I guess one thing I'd like to see, and I don't know if we write it in the policy or not, but we have in several places we've commented that, parent volunteers bring in a richness to the whole program and to the experience. And I see in the athletic piece kind of resistance to having volunteers become a part of the programming. And so and I've told this to Dr. Calvin before, like if you talk to any church, they have a 2-person rule. They never leave an adult with a group of kids without another adult in the room, because if there's 2 people, you've got coverage. It's for the security of the adult and the security of the students. But yet our athletic program allows for 1 adult with a group of kids, and where for the most part that's fine. We have upstanding, wonderful coaches. There are those times where you hear stories from parents or kids that you have no way of validating it because it was just a he said or a she said kind of situation. Whereas if we utilized either parent volunteers or a second somebody on the team, a second adult, I think in policy I would like to advocate for always having 2 adults with athletic teams. So that would be one way parents could definitely, they wouldn't even have to do anything, just be there,
Can I just ask then, would you also want the same sort of standard for clubs and other activities? Because
so the difference there that I see is, because obviously you don't have 2 adults in a classroom, you know what I mean? And so you're differentiating between school and athletics very appropriately. In school, you've got a lot of other people buzzing around. You can keep the door open. That can be definitely something that we say has to happen. But in athletics, that's not always the case. You're off in a field with a group of kids, or you're in a closed gym with a bunch of kids, and there isn't another set of ears and eyes. And I think it would be, for the security of students and for coaches, it would be something that I think we should consider. Because I also hear, a parent wants to volunteer with a team, and they're told, well, there's really nothing you should do. We don't have any place for you. It's contracted out, or whatever. But just being able to watch the kids could be something they could do.
Well, just to be clear, we, even with our general classrooms, sometimes we'll have a bunch of parents who want to come in and do, some one item, and it would be, sometimes it's too much, and the teachers may say, well, maybe not this event, but maybe how about this event, right? And the principals try to make sure they balance that out. So we welcome all support and help to our programs. We don't want to turn people away, but we do, we try to have a balance there, basically. I don't know. I guess I want to, Pam and Lisa, your thoughts on this? Just wondering what your thoughts are.
How many athletic teams do we have that do not have an assistant coach or a volunteer coach involved with the team? So how many teams are we actually talking about that has only that 1 adult?
We can do some research on that.
I'd have to go back and look. I would say there's probably, season by season, just a few where the numbers don't rise to need an assistant coach, and those are the ones that tend to have a volunteer. I'm thinking of girls basketball almost always has a volunteer, but there's no assistant coach, because most of the time the varsity and the JV are practicing together and traveling together to games. So historically, I don't think I could tell you that there was a single metric where we said, okay, this team gets an assistant, this team doesn't. It's usually based on numbers. Like indoor track is huge, so they need an assistant, sometimes 2, to manage just all of the numbers of kids.
Okay. I have to agree that when you have more than 1 adult with a group of kids, it's a definite. It's safer for the adult and safer for the children, especially in this day and age. I would love to be able to say that, if we have a team that just is, even if it is low numbers, we would really want to be seeking a volunteer coach or an athletic volunteer to help with that team. But at the same sense, you don't need 10 athletic volunteers for one team either. So you have to balance it out. So totally, but I would love to have an athletic volunteer if there's only 1 coach for a team, because the adult numbers is important.
Yeah, so I have two things. So one, kind of like Heather, I've never actually been part of an organization that deals with kids that doesn't have a rule about that. So like Girl Scouts, it has to be two unrelated adults have to be there. You can't even have like, you can't have a couple who like does a troop themselves. But I also get, I think having that, making sure that there's some other adult around would be a good idea. My other question actually has to do with just school volunteers, and just to make sure we're not, so for example, I ran the book fair for a number of years, and it's volunteers who come in to do that, but they have to, like, they go into the school and like you have to run your driver's license and all of that. But the way that this policy reads kind of sounds like even those volunteers would have to go now to the superintendent's office to be approved first. So not under the athletic part, but where it just says the school volunteers, that they have to do an application.
So yes, there are cases where, the principals will say, hey, I have a number of volunteers who are going to be working in the building. Here's who they are. My question then is who's gone through Raptor and who hasn't, right? And then once we're all good, okay, go right ahead and do what you got to do, basically. In terms of the principal, go ahead and you can start to get your volunteers. They're all set. Let's move. There are some cases where that's done. I would say consistently, everybody doing that, not all the time. Usually the principal does it at the building level. And then when we go and meet with them, there are discussions that are taking place about what's happening in the school.
Okay. So your approval is basically, carte blanche to the principals. I trust you.
Well, we talk about if there's any concerns happening, if there's someone, sometimes we get people who want to volunteer that it might not be the most appropriate person. There are some concerns I might have with kids or with that person's interaction with children or even adults. And in those
cases, comes back to you then.
Yes.
Okay. That makes sense to me.
Actually, I see this now. So the second sentence is really saying it's not, the principal isn't forwarding the list. The principal is forwarding, this is our criteria for how we choose people. Okay. That
I misread that too, Lisa.
Yeah, it takes away the concern that I had.
I was thinking, how many times have I volunteered and it never got to this in there? So, okay.
So I'm thinking a couple of things. So first offhand, so aside from the general policy, we have a regulation guide as well, okay? So you have your overarching policy procedure, right? Policy, and then we have a procedure guide, right? We have regulation. So how do we put that in action, right? So step one, we make an application. Step two, so we have a procedural guide as well is what I'm saying. And if the board's thought is you want to have a volunteer for every athletic team, we can certainly put that in our regulation / procedure guide, right? That would be the procedure for every team. We can certainly do that. You can also put it if you want to specifically on the policy form if you want to do that. I think a couple of things also. My other thought is, do you want us to take some time to go figure out exactly how many teams we're talking about and what this looks like across the board in the district? So just so you have an understanding of that, or no?
No, I think it's only a handful of teams, I'm sure, that does not have a second adult involved. And it's not every team that needs a volunteer, just a team that only has one adult, just to give them a second adult for their protection as well.
But the other thing is to have that list, right? So that, the assistant coach is sick, so you can call, but I think we have to state that, we really highly recommend that there's 2 adults at all times with our every group of athletes. I just think that that's really, really important. And again, it's kind of like the schools are behind the times because every other organization is covering themselves this way. And it really is for the protection of the adults as well as the students, because
it's a safety net for all.
Okay. All right. So what you want to include is 2 adults per every team. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
the only slippery slope here that I can see is that this will become a contractual thing. If you want to adults per team, then I'm gonna then I can see the Okta coming and saying, then guess what? You're gonna hire us to do those things. You're gonna pay for it.
That is exactly what I was going to ask. Is something to consider would be if you set a policy that's going to require it. Okta is absolutely going to come and say that is our bargaining unit work. We've allowed volunteers in the past when it wasn't a requirement, but now that the board is saying it is a requirement, we will end up having to hire like an assistant coach. They'll still have volunteers because there are folks who just love to volunteer because they don't want the responsibility of having to be there every single time. So my other piece is, I kind of get what you're saying, Heather, about like each team should then have a backup volunteer if somebody were to be sick. But what happens on that short notice day when there is no second adult, there is no, the backup volunteer can't come in that day? Do we cancel practice, not go to a game? Just like logistics we would have to work through if we make the change in the policy.
And just keep in mind the volunteer, if it's a volunteer, not a volunteer coach, volunteers can't coach the team. They have to have all of the certification in order to be able to do that. So if the coach can't come in, then the practice is canceled that day. They can't do the coaching part. Even though many of them could do it, and would want to do it, they have to be certified in order to be doing those things.
Right, but if like, let's say JV and varsity are practicing together and the JV coach is sick, that varsity coach typically takes both teams on, and that would be a great time to call a volunteer and say, you can't help me coach, but you can definitely be here as a, just as a second pair of hands and eyes should, you need to take a group to the bathroom or something. I don't know. Like to me, it's coverage.
Okay. So, and even in that case, I would want to, again, see what is the ratio student to coach, right? If there's a coach coaching two teams, I would be concerned. Does that coach have an assistant coach with them plus a couple volunteers? So I hear what you're saying, Heather. I would just be looking at all of those different things though. Right.
Well, I think maybe it does beg the question that we probably do need assistant coaches for most teams. I mean, I don't know that necessarily like goes to bowling and golf because the teams are smaller, but I don't know. I think it's unsafe.
Do you want, one of the things we could do before kind of solidifying policy, do you want to maybe have a conversation with the other board members, and then based upon what their thoughts are, then we can come back and make a policy? We could work backwards with the end in mind and work, does that, then based on what we hear, then put something together. Does that?
Yeah, I think this is kind of combining a lot of things because the reason this whole volunteer thing started was because there were some people who wanted to volunteer on teams, and they were feeling like they were being treated differently than other volunteers, despite the fact that they weren't going to coach. They were just wanting to be a second pair of hands and eyes. So I think that's where this all started, was kind of like, let's make sure we have a process. I don't see athletic volunteers needing their fingerprinting done. So I think that this definitely aligns with how I read New York State law in terms of the roles that those volunteers play. And so I'm fine with that. I do think that the 2-person thing has to be addressed, and how we go about doing that is probably more cumbersome than this particular policy. This is speaking to just, how do we treat volunteers? Yes. And what is our process for bringing volunteers in? I would like to just emphasize that, we talk about how wonderful and rich volunteers are. I don't think there should be a stiff arm in the athletic department, which I do believe happens.
I don't think there should be a stiff arm as well. Like I really feel like, again, we want to partner with our community, right? We want to work together as a team to do the work that we need to do with and for our kids. So I'm very open. I think all of us want to see what's best for our kids. So, I mean, if you're okay with this as it is, and then maybe having that bigger conversation, or if you want us just to hold off and then come back to this, it's really whatever you all wish to do.
I personally don't think the 2-person thing belongs in this policy. Lisa, I don't know what you're thinking, or Pam, but I don't think it belongs in this policy. I think it's a separate issue that we probably need to discuss separately.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was just going to say the same thing. I think we can move ahead with like the reading of this policy, but
Okay.
maybe for a separate discussion item on a future agenda would be about the 2-person rule.
Okay.
Yes, because I really think that's going to fall into contractual. Because, right, if we're going to say we need it, that falls under Okta's purview. And yeah, we don't want any trouble with, trying to do something that's not right or against a contract. That's not what we're about at all. But we want to keep everybody involved safe. So yeah, that's definitely not the volunteer policy. It's more of that we're going to establish 2 a coach and an assistant coach for all teams. So yeah, I'm okay with the volunteer policy as is because yeah, that requirement is not volunteers.
Okay. That's great. All right. So then, I'm sorry. There was one more policy.
Yeah, the Title I.
Title I.
I'm sorry. Carrie, you want to go ahead and talk about that one? My apologies.
Yes, I wanted to bring the title policy back up just forward because some of the events that we have done have changed in how we actually meet with parents to decide how title funding is spent has changed a little. We've moved it into our school-wide planning as part of the June meeting before the summer, and then it rolls into our district meeting, our DSIP, and then it coincides with all the other pieces. So I just kind of needed to clean that up before, so the next person knows the process of how our title procedures will work with how parent and family engagement information goes forth, how it's passed on to the community and some of the events. So you can see I added in blue some of those pieces that needed to be updated. We had really outdated events and activities listed. So that's really all that we've done to this document is to kind of update and refresh it so that it reflects now 2022 rather than 2020.
And Carrie, just as a question, I mean, this is a lot, but it talks about annually reviewing this with parents and
Yep, it's done during open house. There are PowerPoints sent out. It's on our website. So this is done annually.
Okay.
Yep.
I wondered what the mechanism was for doing that because that seems a little cumbersome, but okay.
Yep, no, it's done. And then there's a parent compact that has to be signed. There's all kinds of forms that have to be kept for this. So
Of
yeah,
course.
it's done every fall.
Yes, Carrie has done it every year. I even remember when I was home and school president at Layton. She would come to our open house to do her presentation, and we had the handouts, and she'd come to a meeting that we would read it again and get our signatures. So yeah, it's been going on for years. Thank you, Carrie, for taking care of it.
Wow.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
any questions?
That mean we're all good? Everybody in agreement with that one as is? Okay.
I'm in agreement with it. Do we want to take out like the highlighting at the bottom that says we must customize and then to make it a clean policy?
Yeah, I'll have Karen do that. Yep.
Not to revisit the volunteer thing, but is there a code of behavior or conduct that volunteers have to sign? Because I think that's also, I saw that with other districts.
There is
I think it's really important.
Yes, there is an athletic code of conduct, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure if they have to sign or not, but I'll check that and find out for sure.
It keeps the volunteer accountable too, and I think that's also important.
Yeah, I will check that. Thank you. Okay, I think that was busy. That was a lot. That was.
We still have 25 minutes. What are we going to do with it?
Drink some water. I'm going to go drink some water. Oh, good. Okay. Well, I'm all set if the board is all good. And do we have someone who want to just move to end the meeting, or are we all good?
I don't think we moved to open the meeting, so I think we're probably good to go. But thank you. This was less painful than I thought it was going to be. So I appreciate everyone's help guiding us. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all. Have a great evening.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Here, guys. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye, Ben.